Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I believe you have your coffee tea review for this morning session with Sage together. We are pleased to invite our Sage speaker, Mr. Richard Zhang, who is presenting the topic, Navigating the Malaysia E-Invoicing Mandate. We are asking the user, Malaysia audience, are you ready? The phase 1 is less than 60 days from now for phase 1 company. We all know that all of us are eagerly to understand what is in for the e-invoicing with Sage 300. I'm going to pass the airtime to Mr. Richard, who is going to show us and help us to understand for this topic. Richard, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our session today on the Malaysia e-invoicing. So for today, we are going to look at Sage 300 and how Sage 300 is going to basically be integrating with the different parties in Malaysia for the e-invoicing. Tomorrow, there will be a similar session for our sister product, which is Sage X3. So if you are using Sage X3, by all means, sign up for tomorrow's session. So let's just kind of get started with this. And the way that I want to approach this is there are people, I think, from many different backgrounds and understanding of what the e-invoicing requirements and that are. And what I would like to do is at least start out with just the fundamentals to make sure that we all have basically a common understanding e-invoicing, so that whether when we talk about this now or in future sessions that we will do, we're kind of all on the same page. Okay. All right. So first of all, let's just have a bit of understanding as to who the different players are going to be responsible for it. I think at least the first one, I think most people are familiar with, which is basically the Inland Revenue Board in Malaysia. So the good folks that more than happy to take your money and that. The other one you may not be so familiar with is called MDEC, which is the Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation. And they are the ones who are basically setting the guidelines and specifications as to how, in this particular case, e-invoicing, in other instances, the different criteria of how they interact with respective government agencies. Okay? The other term that you will hear come up is called PEPL. And what this is, it's basically an organization that sets the standards for enabling the transmission of e-invoices and e-documents throughout the world. Okay, so PEPL or e-invoicing originally started in Europe, I believe in Brussels, and then from there grew to other parts of the world. Here in Asia, also in Australia, also in New Zealand as an example, Middle East to a small extent, and eventually to North America. Okay. The other party that you'll hear us referring to is a company called Sesame. And Sesame is known as an access provider that allows connections between different accounting softwares to LHCN to the purpose of the transmission and the receipt of electronic documents across different businesses and the respective taxing authorities. Okay, so those are the major folks who are going to be involved in this e-invoicing initiative. Okay, well, let's move on and understand. Okay, what is this e-invoicing all about? Right now, this is a bit of a busy screen. A lot of different things in here. So I'm going to just make a slight change here so we can focus and concentrate on some areas of it. Okay, so let's just do this here. Whoops, let me go back here. Okay, where am I? Okay, let's do this. All right. Okay. Basically, in terms of if we wanted to look at the flow of what an e-invoicing is, this initiative is all about, is essentially there's about 6 different steps that have been laid out in common examples. Some of you may be familiar with this diagram or variations of it. Okay, so what happens with this in terms of at the starting point in terms of the issuance of an e-invoice. Okay, so in the issuance of an e-invoice, this is not a PDF file. It's not a Word document. It's not a paper document. It's essentially an electronic document. Okay, so basically this will be in a file in a specific format that's been defined by MDAC working with LHDN. Right. So there's two mechanisms to submit these to LHDN. Okay, one is through their portal. All right. And if you go through the portal route, that means you have to manually collect this information and submit it either as one big file and upload it to that portal. Okay? The other method of doing this is what's known as an API, okay, an API application programming interface. What that does is that it allows basically different applications, and for our example, Sage 300, to be able to connect and submit these things electronically without a user having to, save a file and then log in and upload it to the portal. So the idea behind this is that in the background, all this is automated for you as a user. Okay. Well, okay. So what happens then when I do the submission up to LHDN? Okay. What they're going to do is essentially they're going to take that invoice. They're going to validate, it's the correct taxpayer identification number. They record the amount of the document, the date, and information about the taxes charged and everything in there. All right. Now, once they've completed that process, they will provide back to you what's known as this unique identification number. All right. Okay. So this unique identification number basically says, hey, LHDN has put a stamp on this invoice. They know it's real. They know who the supplier of that invoice is, and then they also know who the customer of that invoice is. Okay, and as it indicates here, this basically number, this unique number allows the traceability within LHDN to ensure that the invoices are not touched or tampered with. Right. Well, what do we do with this unique identification number? Okay. Well, the next step of this process is that once you get that back, basically LHDN sends a notification to you, the supplier, that they've accepted it, and then also to the supplier or whoever that customer is that basically purchased the goods and everything for you. Right. This unique identification number is then used to create what's known as the QR code. Okay. And I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with what a QR code is. And that QR code basically needs to be printed on the invoice. So as an example, you'll see an example of something like this here, where the QR code is basically, printed on that invoice. So for the purpose of Sage 300, we'll be providing sample invoices that have the links to embed the QR codes in there. We also do appreciate that many customers will have their own, customized invoices with their logos and everything for it. So they can use ours as an example of a template to create that, okay? Then the next step is that it talks about in terms of sharing the invoice. So you can do it in the traditional manner of basically, printing the invoice out, emailing that invoice to somebody, putting in the post and mailing it to them that way, okay? However, longer term, when all organizations basically are on e-invoicing, which is in summer next year of 2025, really there isn't a need to basically send these invoices by email or send them by mail anymore, okay? It'll all be recorded in basically LHDN system, and once basically sent back to the customer, we will have the ability then to push it into the Sage 300 system to automatically create an invoice and accounts payable as an example, right? So then the other thing that happens on here is that, as a customer, once you receive the invoice from a supplier, a notification from it, all right, you'll need to take a look to see, is this invoice correct? Did you receive all the goods and everything? Is it the correct goods? Just like you would normally do in a standard invoice that you get, okay? The key part about this is, all right, is that as a customer, you only have a certain limited time in order to accept that invoice, right? Now, right now, that time is set as being 72 hours, okay? So now, it isn't very clear what that 72 hours means. Is it basically 72 hours in terms of business days, or is it just like 72 hours regardless of holidays or weekends, right? So to err on the side of safety, we're thinking that that 72 hours is basically 72 hours, right? So that, kind of might affect the timing with respect to when you review invoices for that, so that you can go back and say, I need to reject, or to my supplier to reject or cancel my invoice, right? Now, the My Invoice portal, the other purpose of it besides submitting documentation is the ability to log in to view all the different invoices that have been sent and received by your organization. Okay, so for those folks who don't have an account with My Invoice portal, or haven't set up, or even become familiar with it, in the next couple of weeks is probably a good idea to start looking at that and getting your account set up, getting your information in there correctly for that. Okay, so at a very high level, that's the idea behind what E-Invoice is all about. Okay, now from the perspective of Sage 300, how does that fit in? Okay, so let's take a look at that. Okay. Whoops, let's go back here. So from the purposes on the Sage 300 side, okay, what we basically have is basically the intermediate piece called the access point, or PEPL access point on here. So in our case, the documents do not go directly to LHDN, okay? They go through what's called a PEPL access point, okay? What is the purpose of this PEPL access point? It serves a couple purposes. One, it serves to ensure compliance across different parties who are exchanging e-documents. Okay? It ensures basically the confidentiality and security of that document before it gets sent on to LHDN. Okay? And then in addition to that, then it also acts as a point of support for questions that may arise as to what happened, why did my document not get sent properly, what was wrong with it, what was the error and everything with it that happens, right? So what then happens then is that in here we see, as an example, in corner one, the supplier issues a document out of Sage 300, out of X3 if you're an X3 user, it automatically gets sent to Sesame, okay? And then from Sesame, what happens is at this particular point, it goes to this API that we talked about briefly earlier through LHDN. Okay. LHDN then basically sends back to us the information to validation of the invoice, what's called a unique identification number that gets sent to us. Okay, it goes back to PEPL, and then from PEPL, it basically goes back to Sesame, and then from Sesame, it gets sent back on to whoever the buyer of that product is. So, hey, hopefully they're a Sage product. Okay, if not, it could be another product, right? So that's basically what happens. Now, this illustrates what's called a four-corner model, but really there's a fifth corner, a fifth player in here, okay? And that is that intermediate piece, the Sesame access point for you to log in to view your documents that got sent to LHDN. Right? So at a very high level, then that's what happens on the Sage 300 side, okay? Now, what we want to do when we're working and creating this electronic invoicing module is basically to hide all this. None of this is information that you needed to know as to how that flow works. That's all handled by the application, so that you as a customer or user of Sage 300 just goes using your normal day-to-day business as normal until you get to the point of time for the submission of the documents to LHDN. Right? Okay, so let's go on the next slide. Okay. Well, one of the things with the e-invoicing is their business thresholds. As an example, for this August 1st deadline, it's basically with organizations that have a revenue turnover of 100 million ringgits or above. Okay. The next sequence of this is basically for folks who are in between the 25 million and 100 million ringgit. That happens in the beginning of the new year. So happy new year, right? We have to get that ready. And then by the time we get to summer of next year, all taxpayers, including the folks who are basically the hawkers and everything, will have to have some means of submitting e-invoices to the government. Right? So basically, that's the timeline that different organizations have to get up to speed on the e-invoicing. Okay, for Sage 300, we have this module called EI, it's e-invoicing module. It requires Sage 300 2024.2 or product update 2 or higher, right? So for customers who are not yet current on 2024.2, we strongly suggest now is the time to start talking with your business partners to start looking at or contemplating that upgrade. Okay. In August, well, actually this will come after that, but we will be releasing the 2025 version in August. So you depending upon where you are on this threshold, if you don't have to meet the August 24th deadline, and you're in that middle threshold for January, then you may also want to think about our 2025 release as well. Okay. The other part about this is basically it does that integration, as I mentioned, to Sesame as that access provider to allow the receiving and transmission of documents without someone having to re-enter that information, or as an example, having to save that information in a file to upload. Right. So our our first phase, our phase 1 for this, is our August 2024 release. In that release, we will have only basically support for the desktop versions of Sage 300. We will have updates later on in 2025 where basic e-invoicing will be supported on our web screens. So if you're a web screen user, you may have to wait a couple months before we get to that, but certainly for desktop users, which right now is one of our more common installs, that's where we are going to be at. Okay. Now, what do we need to do for preparing for e-invoicing? So these are a couple very straightforward slides, right? And we'll talk a bit more about some of this later on. A couple of things very simply, within your company profiles, you do have to make sure we have information about your tax number, your business registration number. That's a very quick thing to do. In terms of preparation, you do want to take a look at your existing AR, AP, invoices, credit notes, debit notes, any things in terms of duplicates. You want to basically look at removing them. Any invoices that need to be canceled, updated, or reissued, you need to talk to your suppliers to get those cleaned up. And one of the last things to do is that, that August date is coming up, and any outstanding documents, credit notes, debit notes, and everything, you want to ideally get those pushed through before all that happens. Okay. So the next item on here is a few items with respect to vendors and customers. Ensuring that we have things such as the correct address, the emails, the legal names, and for that. The customer information is probably the more important at this particular point in time. Okay, so the things such as, once again, addresses, emails, legal names, ship to addresses. If there's SST exemption numbers, and there's going to be a lot more fields in here as well. So one of the things that we will be doing to help ease this migration is we'll provide a checklist of different information that needs to be collected. And then by using that checklist, what we can do with that is be able to have it readily available, so we can let you update it into the e-invoicing module there. The last one was kind of funny, and when I was reviewing a lot of documentation, including the things from LHDN, it says, make sure, internet access is going to be ready and robust in your area. There are exemptions, apparently, if you're in an area where there's poor internet or something. So if you don't have any issues with the internet, something to not pay attention to. But if you do, apparently there are exemptions that LHDN will look at. So keep that in mind for that. Okay. Well, what's our timeline look at? So, we've started this journey basically at the beginning of the year, right? So basically in the early December, There's been ongoing consultations with MDAC and LHDN as to what's going to be needed. And it wasn't until basically the February timeframe that there was a set of documentation and an SDK available. And so in March, we've been designing and working on proof of concepts for that. Okay, so we're in April, May timeframe. We ongoing development in June. So this month we'll be looking at doing an alpha release. And what an alpha release is, basically the very first release of a product. Have that out for some folks to be able to give us feedback on what we have. How easy it is to get set up, how easy it is to basically send transmissions and everything, and to do that. As we get into the next month in July, is when we will start having a control release. So a control release is basically something that's close to being ready to use. Okay, so it would be basically where you can try this out in a sort of real live environment. Potentially doing some testing with it before things actually go live in August, right? So in August is basically what's referred to as our GA, or general availability release. But then what's also going to be important is some of the requirements and landscapes are going to be changing also with this. So we also we're not going to stop working on this after August. We're going to be continue to work on this EI module after August, and there will be ongoing updates for that. So our expectation is that, depending on what changes will be needed, feedback we'll get, there'll probably be maybe at a minimum 1, if not 2 more updates to this EI module in this year. Okay, so that's basically kind of like the timeline of the e-invoicing module for the Sage 300 products. And for X3, I think when that presentation is tomorrow, they'll cover kind of the same thing with that as well. Right? Well, okay, next up then, from discussions that we've had with different customers, different partners in that, there's been a series of frequently asked questions that they've asked of us. So what I want to do is go over probably 6, 8 of the most common ones that come up. And then after that, go and show you that e-invoicing module and where we are at with that as well, okay? So one of the common ones that comes up is like, what is this thing called a PEPL ID, right? So the answer kind of explains what that is. Some people, well, we already have like a TIN number, like, isn't that good enough? Well, just realize that that taxpayer identification number is to identify yourself as a taxpayer to LHDN. Okay, the PEPL ID is, think about that as basically a phone number for your business. Okay, or maybe your website domain. It's unique to you as a business, and that number is recognized internationally, right? So if that's one day North America adopts PEPL and you're doing business or trading with us, then that PEPL ID you have will be known to organizations in North America, as an example. Then, the other question is that, well, how do I go about getting this PEPL ID? And I'll show you that when we get into the product itself. The ID is provided by Sesame. There's a register button in the setup for the EI module, or you would put in your information for your company, and some specific fields are required. Click on the register button. That sends that information to Sesame, who then provides you your PEPL ID. Okay, so that's what the PEPL ID is about, right? The next one that comes up is that when do I need to submit these e-invoices? Is it the same day, the same time that the invoice is made? Well, there isn't any specific requirement for that. Okay, so to minimize basically changes in your workflow, okay, and the time that folks will spend doing invoices, unless you're doing a really high volume, our suggestion to do it basically once a day, or even depending on the volume invoices, once every couple of days. Okay, so there isn't anything specific, but as I said, if you make it a habit, just like if, as an example, if you're processing credit cards, you do a cash out at the end of the day, maybe the same idea here at the end of the day, you may want to do the submission there, right? The other one is that, okay, different organizations have different ways that they number their invoices, even across different, I guess, software applications. No, there isn't. There isn't any specific changes that you need, okay? The only thing that's going to be different with that invoice you submit is that you get back what we call this unique identification number, okay? And that unique identification number, which we then translate into the QR code on the invoice. So no changes that's needed on there, okay? The other one that comes up is what is a self-billed invoice, okay? Basically, a self-billed invoice comes across in a couple of situations, right? If you're purchasing goods or services that from folks outside of Malaysia, obviously, if you're buying something from Australia, as an example, they don't have to make any submission to LHDN for validation, right? But what has to happen is that you, as that customer, have to do that submission, okay? So another example on here is things such as, profit distributions or dividends or interest that can come into play that get issued from one organization, maybe a parent company to a subsidiary company or vice versa, okay? So these self-bill invoices at this particular point can be entered via the My Invoice portal, right? We're also looking at enhancing the e-invoicing such that these can be basically self-generated from within the application itself. But our criteria right now, our most important criteria, is basically setting up the most common use case, which is the submission of invoices generated between Malaysian businesses, right? And the other question that comes up with these self-invoices, what is the submission time frame? And it's different than that of a normal invoice, okay? So, and once again, these are the current rules. We know we're not here to provide guidance or whatever, so your best bet is to follow whatever the applicable rules or legislations are. But we've laid out as an example, if it's imported goods, there is one time frame. If you're purchasing services from an organization outside Malaysia, there's a different time frame as to when these have to be submitted. Right? Okay, moving on. What happens when I submit it, once the invoice gets submitted and has been validated by IRBM? Well, unfortunately, what happens is that, and we briefly talked about this earlier, you've got basically 72 hours to either accept, cancel, or reject this invoice, okay? And the changes will have to be done from the supplier by either issuing a credit or debit note, depending upon what is applicable, to basically cancel that invoice or make changes to that, right? So that's basically done through the portal, and notification comes across back to us on that, okay? And then we will get the appropriate status for that once it gets rejected or needs to get amended. Well, okay, so if you're a company that's doing $100 million ringgit, you're probably doing not one or two invoices a day, but you're probably doing a whole bunch of invoices a day, right? And so one of the things that comes to play is that, well, isn't this going to slow down my clerks from processing invoices and taking orders and that? There may be, but it'll be very minimal. And the reason why for this is that the invoicing module, it basically runs in the background, okay? Now, as I said, the time that invoices, you can send them, as soon as you basically process it if you want, or you hold it and batch it for submission at the end of the day, right? What happens then is that when the e-invoicing is sent off for validation to LHDM, it just basically goes away and your staff continues on to the next invoice and so on, okay? So, and we'll show you when we get to the module itself, basically the ability to select which invoices that you want to submit, and from there send them off to LHDN in the EI module. One of the things you may also want to consider when you're doing this, especially with a large organization, is that there's going to be a designated person that does that as part of their function on a regular basis, and then a backup person to do that if that person is either on holidays or sick or something like that. Okay, and that way you can make sure all this gets submitted, right? once the EI module submits an invoice, it's not going to let you basically resubmit it. Okay, it keeps track of what gets submitted and what gets a return code from LHDN for validity. Right. Many of our customers have both order entry and accounts receivable, and one of the concern that comes up is that, well, the order entry invoice flows in accounts receivables. Well, how do we make sure that doesn't get submitted twice? We know where the invoice is coming from, whether it's coming from OE and AR. If that invoice resides in order entry and it gets set up for submission, we basically mark it and it doesn't get resubmitted out of accounts receivable by accident. So there's basically checks and balances built into the e-invoice module to prevent those things from happening. Okay, so one of the, I think probably a question that does come up frequently, how long is it going to take for me to install and set up the 300 e-invoicing module? As I mentioned, one of the things here is that it kind of really depends, okay? So what I've got down here are basically just guidelines for that, right? So the best bet as a customer is to speak with your business partner. You know, they can provide some more detailed estimates as to what may be required. So like as an example here, I'm saying, hey, look, if you're already on Sage 300 24.2 and you've got the Sage 300 program installed in one central server, installing and the invoicing module itself is going to probably take about an hour or so, right? If you have your Sage 300 programs installed across, 40 different workstations, okay, well, that's a different discussion, because then you may have to look at having to install that e-invoicing module on those workstations that need to process e-invoicing. Okay, so that might take longer. Then the other thing also is that if you need to do backups of your databases and that, depending upon the size of your database, that might also take time as well. Okay, so there's several different variables that go into this, and we're looking at this sort of just as a rough guideline as to what's going to be required. Right? Then after you got the e-invoicing module installed, well, the next thing we need to look at is basically the setup of the customer information, like PEPL IDs, the industry codes from Malaysia, taxpayer identification numbers, and this could be less than an hour, could be a day or more, just depending upon what changes you need to have on here. So one of the things that we're going to do on here is to provide an example Excel template where this information can be collected and later on just be imported into the e-invoicing module, just like if you were setting up accounts receivable, and you need to basically then put in information in there for the customers, right? Then the other item to take a look at is training. And I think that's just the biggest variable, right? If you're computer literate, you're familiar with 300 and so on, it won't take too long to get up to speed with the module to get us set up in that. And so, this can be, as I said, depending upon you're familiar with that, could be a few hours, could be a day or more, just depending on how many people need to be trained and then brought up to speed with that. Okay. Now, so these are some of the common FAQs that have popped up. I'm sure there'll be other questions that they may have. So we're going to do a Q&A later on. But before we get to that, I want to switch over to Sage 300 now and to give you a feel for what that EI module is about and what's in there. Okay, so let me do that. Minimize this, and okay, so what you'll see is that when you install it, and it's treated just like another module. Okay, so for the folks familiar with Sage 300, you'll notice on here is that if I go to my about here, licenses, I'll see basically there's e-invoicing module in here, e-invoicing 2024 module. Okay, so it's a separate module, and it's activated and set up, just like any other standard modules. Okay, in terms of the setup, one of the things that the first part is basically the options. Okay, and this is where I was mentioning in terms of getting your PEPL ID and registration. So you basically will default some of this stuff from the existing common services. Okay, other ones are items that you may need to basically enter in here, such as the industry and whoever the contact might be for your organization when they're dealing with HDN, right? So after that happens, what we want to do is basically you need to click on the register button here, okay? And then that will basically forward this information to Sesame, who is the access point, to do the registration. And once that's complete, what will happen is that right now this is basically blank, but you'll be provided with a PEPL ID that's going to be unique to your organization. Okay, so that's kind of like the first step in terms of the setup. So fairly straightforward on here. Okay. Now after that's set up, then there's going to be customer information to enter that you may need to do here. The customer one is still a work in progress, so we're working through the different ones on here. You may or may not have to do some stuff with respect to currency code mapping. And what is currency code mapping about? Well, we have the currency codes that exist in Sage 300, right? So a common one is Australian dollar, Singapore dollar, whatever. And then there's another one, which is a PEPL currency. Now, the reason why we have this is that the currency that gets sent, if you're dealing with organizations outside of Malaysia, they may use a different currency code to designate an Australian dollar. So, they may call it just AU as an example, right? So we need to basically be able to map that currency code to the PEPL currency, right? And the same with some other ones here, unit and measure mapping if you're dealing with inventory, and miscellaneous charges mapping on here. Okay, so those are a few other items that need to get set up, but these are typically lightweight. The largest one is going to be customers, and so that's one that we're working through for that. Okay, now how do I make use of this EI module for the purposes of transmitting invoices to LHDN? Okay, so to do that, let me walk through an example here. So what we're going to do is we are going to go create an invoice in order entry, right? So we're going to do a shipment on here. We're going to do a customer. Okay, no currency. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not going to worry about that one. All right. And what I'm going to do here is basically we'll just pick an item here very quickly. I should want, and I'm going to ship 10 of these. Okay. Okay, and I'm going to, from here, just create an invoice. And so we can take a look at this. This is what works. I'm going to call it June 11 or June 12th, I guess, right? Okay. And we're going to basically go ahead and post this invoice. Right. Okay. So the invoice gets posted. Yeah, I get a warning about I don't have the currencies and everything. That's fine. I'm just going to ignore that. Okay. So you notice on here, I basically got set up on here, invoice number June 12th. Okay. Now, no, I'm not going to print this. Okay, so throughout the day, you would be basically processing invoices, orders, shipments that go out. Okay, so as I said, if you want, you can submit these things one by one if you want, but really I suggest you just basically save them, do it towards the end of the day or every couple hours, however you want to choose, right? Because what happens now is the invoice gets created, okay? My next step on here is just like the normal processing in terms of sending information over to accounts receivable invoices, I need to run a DN, okay? So we run the DN, okay? So now the DN has basically generated a batch in accounts receivable for that invoice that I put through, right? So if I go into accounts receivable here just very quickly, transactions, batch list, right? So here's that invoice I just generated on here for 981 ringgits, okay? It came over from order entry, right? So let's close that. So now I want to send this information up to LHDN. So I go to transactions. I'll select my outgoing document processing, okay? And in here, we're still working on this piece because right now it shows me a list of different invoices here. If I click on refresh, right, you notice that when I clicked on refresh, one of the things that happened here is it basically created or pulled in this invoice for me called June 12th, right? So that's the invoice that I just did for June 12th, okay? So this will provide me a list of all the different invoices that need to get submitted to LHDN. Now, one other item that we're working on for this is that we need to build in here basically an area where you can select the different invoices to get set up. Like as an example, all invoices for this particular date range, all invoices that have not been selected, all invoices for customer range. So that's the next part we're working on, right? So what happens here then is that with this invoice, okay, you would basically, if you want to do this individually, select the different invoices that you want to send up to HDN. Or as I said, once we have the other pieces added in here, to be able to select, all the ones that are basically with a status of no for us automatically. Okay, so let's just basically select this one, right? And let me make this a bit bigger. So what's going to happen is that it'll give you some information about that document, right? So as an example here is not sent. You'll see that there's a series of different ones have error, and that's because we've been testing out different error codes that come back to make sure that those are valid. Now, this one here is probably going to fail because, and I'll explain to you why. So if I click on send here as an example, right? So June 12th, it does some data validation for that document to make sure things are in order. So if we take a look here, it says the PEPO ID is invalid, right? And if you remember, well, the reason why that came up or why that's coming up is in my ID, we haven't at this particular point did our submission to Sesame in order to grab an ID. So that ID is, as you said, right now, it's blank, okay? So basically, it's saying that, hey, without that information, we're not going to be able to send that through for you on here, right? So, that gives you basically, a capsule summary of, what that process is going to be for the submission of those documents to LHDN. Okay, so once they come back, you can check the different statuses on here to take a look on here. So basically, once you've hit the send button, you just go away, right? There isn't someone that needs to stand here and watch it. Okay, there is in here the refresh button. Okay, and what the purpose of the refresh button is that if you do send something off right away, and you want to basically track the status of it, you can click the refresh button and it'll update the statuses for you, right? But otherwise, once you hit send, you go away, have your coffee, have your tea, or come back in the morning or whatever, and the document works, as I mentioned, it's a background process. So if you're sending 100 of these, you basically pick that range, send it off, and then away you go, right? So there isn't any interruption in the day-to-day workflow of your users on there, all right? Okay, so that's a quick capsule update as to where we are with the LHDN module. So Lynn, I think you mentioned there might be some questions that come up or something, or? Okay, so I see a couple questions on here. Okay, let me see here. If we are using the web client, does the module support web services? Okay, right now, we don't have the EI module for web screens yet, okay? When we do get to basically the building of the web screens, which I said is in April next year, then we will basically have support for web services for that module. Okay. Question 3. Sage 300 is free and complimentary to access UBS for e-invoicing. That one I'm not familiar with. I don't know if there's someone from the Sage Asia team that would be familiar with that. Okay, so maybe Lynn, we can move on to the next question, and then somebody can pick that up later on. Okay. Okay, question. If my company is only required to commence e-invoicing in July 2025, what are the procedures and preparation the company has to do for the implementation of e-invoicing if the company is presently using Access Sage accounting and billing? I can only speak to that in a general sense. And the general sense is basically the preparation of collecting information about your customers. What their PEPO ID is going to be, what their TIN number is, or SST numbers, and all those different components. Okay. Now, in terms of how Access Sage accounting and billing are going to be implementing the e-invoicing requirements, that I'm not sure. I'm not sure if who might be able to answer that one. So I would hopefully somebody from the Sage team can pick that up later on. Is Access UBS and Sage 300 different software? Yes, they are totally different softwares, different applications, different companies, and that. So our discussion here is about Sage 300. So yeah, I can't really speak to what Access USB is doing. So does the company have to apply for their own digital certificate, or does Sage provide service to sign an e-invoicing using the company's digital certificate? There isn't any digital certificate that I'm aware of that you need to acquire. Okay, all of the signing of the invoices and validation of the invoices are provided through Sesame and then from LHDN. So from my understanding, there is an additional software that you need to get for this. In Sage 300, what is the point in time when the invoice is sent to IRBM for validation? Is it click print to view or post? Okay, let me answer that by, I believe I'm still showing my screen here. The validation happens when you come into the e-invoicing module and hit send. Okay, it is not done at the time when the invoice gets printed, okay, or previewed, right? It is a separate process that you have to go through for that. Okay, next question then. Oh, okay, so I think the one other thing that comes to mind when we're working and building this thing is that why set this thing up as a background process? Okay, the reason why we set this thing up as a background process is there's a couple parties involved. There's ourselves, okay. There is Sesame, there is MDAC, and there is LHDN. Right. So we don't know at this particular point because nothing has gone live to say that if we send a document to LHDN that the response will be instantaneous or 1 second or something before you get that validation back, right? So if we were to basically wait and say, as soon as you print an invoice, okay, or post an invoice, it's going to get sent to LHDN. Well, I don't know if the network is busy. If there are a lot of people using it, especially when everybody goes live next year, I don't know how long that lag might be. I mean, you may be sitting there for a minute, could be 5 seconds, or could be 1 second. We just don't know. And rather than basically hold up your day-to-day workflow, we've basically done it this way so that you just can continue on using your application. Okay. Okay. So next question. Is Sesame going to be the only provider, or can we subscribe to other ones? At this particular point, it is just Sesame as a provider. They basically are certified as an access point through MDAC. So they I think we're one of the first ones to do that. So we basically have partnered with them for that. And just as a quick aside, for any of the folks who may be familiar with in Singapore, they're also our access provider for the Invoice Now application that's required by IRAS in Singapore. So they've got quite a fair amount of experience in this area. Okay, so how to prepare bills for import of goods from overseas. So this goods from overseas one is the idea called self-invoicing or self-billing. Okay. So currently right now, for those where you're importing goods or services from overseas, that information gets basically entered through the LHDN My Invoice portal. Okay. We are looking at basically what's going to be needed to basically do self-billing straight out of the 300 application, but that will be in an upcoming release. So short term, it would be through the use of the My Invoice portal for any import goods or services from outside of Malaysia. Okay, so the question is, I wish to know about self-bill invoices for imports. If I'm not wrong, I heard self-bill need to submit to My Invoice portal instead of through Sage. Yeah, we're getting clarification on that as well, but our understanding is that they do have access points to allow for self-billing invoices to come through an accounting application. It kind of just doesn't make sense that the only way to do this is through My Invoice portal, because if you are a trading company and you have a lot of things coming in from imports and everything, to have to manually do this through My Invoice portal. So I would say to this question and the previous one is stay tuned. We are working through what's going to be required for self-billed invoicing. Okay, it says, what if there's any credit note for the invoice that has been issued due to incorrect billing? So what happens to this is, if you recall, the customer has 72 hours to basically, dispute that document, right? So if they dispute that document, you can issue a credit note against that document. So the credit note will reference the original document, and we'll keep a record of what's called that unique identification number. And so it'll reference that unique identification number, so that when it gets submitted back to LHDN, they'll know that that original invoice has either been, the full amount has either been canceled or a change has been done to it to reduce the amounts. And the same is true with respect to a debit note also. Okay, seeing there's another question or anything, Lynn?
Richard, can you hear me now?
Sorry, I didn't catch it, Lynn.
Okay, you can hear me right now.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for holding, guys. There was a question about the early part. Let me switch over. There's some question that we're missing out. Early part. Okay, the first one. There are quite a number of UBS, Access UBS customer, and you guys are eagerly to ask about e-invoicing with Access UBS. And you all know that in the past, Sage do have the relationship with UBS. Now we are sharing with you that Sage 300, the module that we developed just for Sage 300 only, and it's not free and complimentary for Access UBS. You may check with the Access group to see whether do they have it, the e-invoicing module. This UBS product is under another company, and we are not servicing and not longer under Sage. So we can answer about how the Access UBS product will handling the e-invoice. Okay. Some other question is, you Access UBS and Sage 300 a different software? Yes, they are different. Like what Richard had mentioned to you guys, to the team, to the customers that using UBS, we are a different software. So if you are interested in how Sage 300 using invoice to manage the backbone of the business, to manage the mandatory compliance for Malaysia, to reach out to us about the survey, and we can come back to you how and what we can help together. There are more questions coming to the floor right now, and we see the certain timing limit already. I will just read out the last question and we will end the session. But it is not the end. We will follow up with more webinars, next webinar that we are planning in the end of July, that we'll share with you before 1st August. What do you expect, especially for Sage 300 customer? I'm going to raise the most common question from the floor right now. There are quite a number of questions coming out again and again. Okay, so there is a last one question that came up quite frequently. I'm going to read out here. Richard, is more for you. For the e-invoicing module, the information on the customer, does it take information on the existing AR module, or is a blank file, which we need to import all the information?
Okay, so the question is that in the basically the e-invoicing customer module, which is this particular one here, do you have to start all over again if you already have existing customers in AR? I believe that's what the question is. Okay.
Yeah.
So the answer to that one is that we will pull information that's already in the AR customer, things such as their address, their phone numbers, emails, and so on. Okay. But there is information that's required for e-invoicing which does not currently exist in AR in the customers. So once again, as I said, things such as their PEPL ID, things such as their SST numbers or TIN numbers, depending where they are, and so on. So that information is information that will need to be entered into the customer module here. And in one of the slides I had, we'll be working to provide an Excel template where you can get started to create that information, so that when the EI module is available, all you need to do is basically import that into that with that.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. Thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. You will receive the survey, a playback video for today's webinar, as well with the presentation. And we will appreciate if you could complete that and provide your feedback to us. What exactly you are seeing yourself in invoicing? What kind of challenges that you want Sage 300 or as a whole, as a Sage group, to see how we can power the business together? Now, if you have any other question, please get in touch with us directly or through the partners. Well, on behalf of the Sage team, thank you for joining us today, and stay tuned for Malaysia e-invoicing. We will have a lot of exciting announcements and news for all our Sage 300 users as well as customers. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Richard, and thank you for all the people in the. Have a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.